I'm Mike Harrison from BioForward. Welcome to the 1:30 panel discussion, It Takes a Village, Perspectives on the Biologic Novel Modality Drug Development Journey. This is a really important topic, one that can benefit so many of the young therapeutic companies that we have in Wisconsin from the translation stage through commercialization. These partners can not only bring in expertise during development, but can speed the process to commercialization. Those partners include such Wisconsin companies as LabCorp and Catalent. Before inviting our panelists out, I would first like to introduce Nick Staple, who is representing Excelsior Labs, our sponsor for this session, to say a few words.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon session. My name is Nick Staple, representing Excelsior Laboratories. Thank you to Lisa and the BioForward staff for providing this warm and welcoming space for us all to meet. Excelsior Labs is thankful for the opportunity to join the local Wisconsin research ecosystem and for the time to introduce ourselves and our services. We are a brand new contract research organization purpose-built to meet the needs of modern drug developers. We invested several $million at the end of 2021 with our first research studies completed in May 2022. So absolutely brand new and here to meet the needs of the local community. Our team comes with decades of experience from the local catchment, and we excel at custom rodent model development, characterization, and study conduct. We have experience with cell-based therapies, antibody development, gene therapy modalities, and oligonucleotides, and so we're looking forward to starting discussions with you about how we could potentially help your research. Our flow cytometry instruments have 45 colors, which is pretty impressive. We offer cytokine analysis, sequencing, and gene expression. So we're excited to bring these to the local community, and we would love to speak with you about supporting your research. So please stop by our booth to meet the team, and again, welcome to the afternoon session. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to specifically thank the BioForward team for the opportunity to speak with you today at BioHealth Wisconsin Summit, and to Excelsior Labs for sponsoring the session, and you, of course, for joining us today. Our session today is meant to be a fireside chat around the drug development journey. We're here today because Madison has proven to be a center for innovation and in the biomedical space, but it's a long road from an innovative idea to an approved therapy that can impact patient outcomes, which is why we've described it as a journey. I'm your moderator today, Lorraine Kavanaugh, and as a global account executive at Cytiva, I'm responsible for alliance management between Cytiva and pharmaceutical partners. And I am joined today by, oh, there we go. One of these days I'll figure this out. So that's me. We're joined today by Dr. Emily Schirmer. Emily joined Catalent in 2015 and is responsible for upstream and downstream process development, analytical development, and manufacturing sciences and technologies. Welcome, Emily. Thanks. We're also joined by Dr. Erin Slosarek, Study Director in Cell and Gene Therapy at LabCorp. She's experienced in conducting studies with both small and large molecules, cell and gene therapies, and with multiple routes of administration. Welcome, Erin. Thank you. We are also joined via telepresence today by Dr. Abhi Gupta, who leads cell and gene therapy for the commercial strategy and innovation teams at Pfizer. In this role, he leads the end-to-end development and commercialization of Pfizer's gene therapy pipeline. And he should pop up in a few slides. Welcome, Abi. And last but not least, we're joined by Dr. Sean Muthian. Sean's work in portfolio strategy is two-pronged. First is driving specific customer value propositions in Cytiva's technological response and strengthening long-term partnerships with our key customers. He's also working on developing deeper relationships with stakeholders in the startup biotech ecosystem. Welcome, Sean. Now, before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to orient ourselves around who are the organizations on the panel today and how we fit into the ecosystem. This slide describes at a high level the stages that a therapy goes through. So starting with basic science to come up with the targets and the models that need to be addressed, moving into first in humans, some of the early testing that needs to be done, assessing patient impact, and then of course translating through to medical practice. Then below that you see a brief overview of the clinical stages through which any therapeutic would have to progress in order to make it out to the clinic. Now below that, we have a quick description of sort of who in the village. We entitled this, It Takes a Village. Who's in the village supporting these stages? Early R&D and preclinical work, as you all know, is historically where academia and the translational centers sit, like the local Weizmann Center. Small biotech of various sizes sit in the preclinical and early clinical stages of the journey. Groups in the contract development and manufacturing space, like Excelsior, Catalent, LabCorp, help outside organizations bring their therapies to market and provide various services in service of that goal. Large pharma, like Pfizer, are amongst the therapy originators with in-house R&D, clinical, and commercial production capacities. And last on the list, we have Cytiva, who serves as a partner across the entire life cycle, supplying products, services, software, and equipment. And so with that orientation, let's begin. Hello, Abi. Can you hear us and see us well?
Very much so, and happy to be here.
All right. So the first question for the panel, and the way I'll do this is really throw all of the questions open to the panel broadly, is about the current state of biotech and the startup segment of the biohealth industry, from both sides of the fence, from the biotech and from big pharma perspective. So what are you all seeing in the industry right now? Specifically, what are some of the major headwinds that you're coming across?
I'll go ahead and get started. I think one thing that we see at the contract manufacturing and development level is various different modalities coming that our partners are expecting us to support. So historically, I can give you an example. Catalent has supported recombinant protein therapies, now being asked to step out, support mRNA vaccines and therapies, gene and cell therapies as well. So our partners are looking for that diversity in support. And keeping up with that is often a challenge to bring in the right skill sets, the right technologies to be able to support that.
Thank you.
So I think in the larger industry sense, from idea to market, some of the challenges may reside within a certain pocket, like technological challenges. How do you get to scale, as Dr. Cook said, from 1 mg, 2 mgs to maybe 500 mgs, right, from a small molecule model? In the context of cell and gene therapy, antibodies, I mean, how do you scale those into larger quantities for later stage clinical testing and certainly commercial? So that's one aspect, right? But then with new modalities, some of the challenges are the regulators themselves, and this technology is new to them as well. So what is their position? How do they look at incoming packages for review in terms of getting it through their gatekeeping system? So there are multiple points, particularly with new technologies, where there are a learning curve. This learning curve existed before when biologics, the traditional biologics we speak of with recombinant proteins and antibodies came to the market. But now you have several of these, right, with mRNA, with different nucleotide technologies, with cell therapy. So these modalities are hitting up against what would the regulator need to see to be comfortable and confident that it's safe, in addition to providing the efficacy that's claimed. Hope that helps.
No, that's great. Thank you. Abhi, what are you seeing?
Well, first and foremost, what's really exciting, and just to kind of build on, the variety of platforms that are available, I think it's really exciting time for patients, physicians, and providers, because there's a whole host of platforms out there that we didn't have before. At the same time, I think the biggest headwind that you're seeing right now is just financing, especially in the biotech ecosystem for gene therapies. You have a multitude of companies out there that have unique platforms and are treating diseases that were previously intractable. And so what you have is all this dry powder that's sitting outside, and just the kind of the economic state that we're in. It's been a little bit challenging for the startups, at least the ones that we talk to make a lot of inroads. Having said that, I think there's possible ways to manage around it, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that.
All right, thank you. And that does lead really directly into the next question, which is, what have you seen as some of the best ways to navigate these headwinds?
I think part of it, to Sean's point, is being able to acknowledge and adapt really quickly to what you're seeing. And really quickly is on various different timelines there, but being able to anticipate and adapt to the varying regulatory industry, the varying finance industry, as Abdi mentioned, is a tough thing to do. But I think with the right teams in place and the right strategy at your sites and at your companies, you can attain that.
So I think that one of the things that we have done at LabCorp is we have subject matter experts. So people who specialize in these new areas, who are able to help clients, help sponsors, develop these studies, go through with them the process to get to the FDA, and then help them manage that both financially and in a timely manner.
I think this goes back to the ecosystem that we're talking about. So in a large company where most of these resources may be internally available, in a smaller startup environment, you reach out to expert pockets and you pull together a team that helps solve this, right? And so with the regulatory, for example, there are individuals who are experts with interfacing there and getting an early conversation as to what that looks like. With financing as well, those opportunities exist. Now, the current liquidity issue notwithstanding, there is a lot of funds available for you to be able to access. Those, of course, are channels and opportunities for you to be able to navigate through. I will say, though, that despite the liquidity crunch, what will typically fall out after this particular crisis will be the optimization of a portfolio, whether it's in large pharma or in the biotech ecosystem. So smaller companies with less developed ideas may take a step back, and then others with more mature concepts and ideas and proof of concepts will get further funding. So the marketplace begins to manage itself by virtue of the better ones bubble up, and the others may have to retool or take a step back and reinvent themselves. So in all of these are opportunities, but it's not get disillusioned that it doesn't take the same path that you imagined it would, because it almost never does.
Yeah, I would add, just building on that, there's 2 points that stick out on how to navigate these headwinds. One is to have a really compelling story, really understanding what your approach is, and also what your business model is. So for example, we see a lot of companies that are platforms and or asset companies, but it's really important to know, are you a platform company or an asset company? And if you do both, how are you prosecuting each independently and de-risking them? And I think just having all that in a very concise manner and an effective storytelling is just really important, at least to us at Pfizer, because it helps us figure out what is that differentiation in the platform or the asset, because there is so many companies out there. The second thing I think that's really important more than ever right now is to talk often, because you want to reach out to either a Pfizer or peer groups in the vast network that we have, because you're never alone in this, in developing programs. And so collaboration is certainly the name of the game. And so you want to talk often, at least even to Pfizer, because there may be some tidbits of value or advice that we can provide that can help shape your strategy really early on, such that when the idea is a little bit more mature, it is well thought out from like a big pharma perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, Abhi, great points. A couple of things to think about. The early and often engagement, it's great because I think you will learn a lot from the questions that are being asked, right? How is the potential partner thinking? What are they looking for? So that's important. And the other point Abhi made with regard to platform versus single assets, there's certainly value in the platform, because if one fails, you have the platform basically is the engine that's going to throw out potential other candidates. On the flip side, single asset organizations, if you've noticed what the market's doing right now, are combining. So their investors are moving them into creating portfolio of companies. Medici did that, I think, maybe 2-3 years ago by combining several immunology assets. Ventyx Biosciences out of California has in fact pulled together several of its assets into one organization. And so single assets could be challenging, because what if one fails? But if you've got a portfolio, either through internal growth or by combining with fellow startup companies to craft a portfolio, is also another way to think about how would you position yourself into the next iteration of the company.
And I'll just add, I think that aligns the collaboration point and really using your village, so to speak, leveraging that network to get to where you need to be. So you don't have to be an expert in everything. That's why there's contract labs. That's why there's big pharma. That's why there's conferences. But really sharing that networking to push your programs forward. It really does take a village to get there.
Thank you. Given the fact that we've got such a tremendous innovation engine in the area, the medical school, small pharma, lots of great ideas and new modalities coming forward, what do you see as the big differences between working at a very early research scale and being able to move these assets up into larger scales? What are things that folks should consider at this very early stages? Let's go around the other way. Abhi, can we start with you?
Sure.
Thanks.
I feel like I could talk about this for a long time. No, but there's a lot of differences between early academic stage and kind of how big pharma thinks, right? So big pharma is trying to get medicines to patients in a very standardized and robust way, and that's really the goal. So internally within Pfizer, we have a saying, which is one, think with the end in mind, and two, you don't get do-overs. And so the lesson there really is that if you're really early and you're a company that's coming out of academia or a program or really early on, you really want to think about all the steps. And like it was stated, that you won't have all the expertise, you won't have all the pieces, but you want to collaborate, you want to talk and get that advice. And so what we see is, for example, a lot of decisions that get made really early on have to be changed potentially over time. So for example, what is your manufacturing approach? Thinking about research scale versus commercial scale are very, very two different things. And then also, like, what diseases are you going after, and how do you plan to, supply the clinical trials to make sure that you can prosecute them in a very timely fashion, and that manufacturing is not like an impediment, to the competitive landscape, that exists. So those are just some, and then mostly, just thinking about, just recognizing the fact that this is still very much early days for cell and gene therapy, and so there's a vast amount of non-standardized approaches that different companies are taking. That will be different, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. And the reason that's important is because a lot of companies are in that preclinical arena right now. And by the time they get to a regulatory filing, maybe the standards will be a little bit different. So it's really important to know, what does that full development and commercial picture look like, and to do a lot of upfront homework, and at least talk to people about it to make sure you're building kind of the robust, plans today.
Yeah, now maybe something that complements that is around, I think you mentioned the decisions that are made along the path can certainly change. And so we approach our development that way, because a lot of times looking for a phase 1 delivery to the clinic, it's all about speed, because time is money at that point in time. A lot of small biotechs are venture backed. So the dollars have to speak for themselves as the outcome of that timeline. As we get into later phase, though, we certainly have to add that robustness. So decisions that we made for a phase 1 process may not be what it looks like for a phase 2, a phase 3, a commercial process. And so being willing, again, that adaptiveness as you go through the life cycle of your therapy is really important, to understand that you're not stuck with an early phase process, and you can change with the right methods.
So one of the things that comes to mind when we talk about, changing is, stem cell therapies. And so you think about over the last 15 years, how things have changed for stem cell therapies, just in general. So as an example, 15 years ago, I'm aging myself, at my first research lab that I was working on with stem cells, we were making a GMP grade bank of cells, and we're just now getting, they're going into phase 1 clinical trials with those cells. It's a lot different at this point. The FDA looks at those stem cells a lot differently than they did 15 years ago, because we have a lot more information about those cells. So yes, cell characterization is important. Having them produced in a manufacturing facility is also important, but there aren't the fears that there were about teratoma formation and things like that we saw 15 years ago, when we didn't have as much information as we have now. So again, it's the adaptability over time with these newer therapies, and understanding that the FDA is also going to change what they expect based on the knowledge that they're getting over time.
So I think the opportunity here that you're hearing is, particularly if you're at the cutting edge, the leading edge of a new modality, there's an opportunity to educate and make aware of stakeholders, of the possibilities, of the potential, right? In the early startup game, when I spent some time in the hedge fund, life science, venture capital sector, it was really around, price of dreams. How is a company evaluated? The idea is selling the idea. At this moment, early on, it's pretty conceptual, but the opportunity is to educate and make aware, right? I mean, that's when you push the boundaries. So that's on the one side in terms of new modalities. But when you take a step back and you think about from idea to market, you can think about bucketing these into several risk categories, right? So in the early phase of looking after or developing something to target an indication, right? Going after non-small cell lung cancer that is not being treated by Keytruda, et cetera, yeah? And so the risk that you're addressing there in the early phases, where you're really good at translational science centers, academic centers, is around understanding the biology, de-risking it, making sure that the target and the mechanism works as it should in the disease process as you intend to treat it. So that's the biology risk. And you get a little further along, you get into the clinical risk. Is it going to have the clinical profile that you want? And then the regulatory risk, are the regulators going to be comfortable with this, right? Those are the other added elements of risk. But along this value chain is the specific risk associated with the asset, the technical component in terms of, is it doable? Are you able to make it in the right quantity for the kinds of study you want to accomplish? And does it have the right profile and attributes to give you the clinical impact that you want to see? So if you begin thinking about how do you bucket these risks and then how do you think about solving them with the underpinning that you have to be flexible with optionality, right? So go where the science takes you. If the data doesn't quite follow into NSCLC, maybe that's an application into renal cancer, right? So the idea is be flexible with options as you think about what path that could take, recognizing that there are these risk buckets that you may be able to partner with to solve as you go along. I've said a lot in this little minute spiel, but we can certainly have a Q&A after this to address some of those.
So I think there's been some really great points raised by you all collectively here. I think there is a perception that the regulatory bodies are quite rigid, and the concept that you can really educate them, bring them along on the journey with the science is something that folks really do need to consider. And something that was touched on briefly by Abhi at the beginning about clinical trials and the ability to execute those in the landscape of all of the things that are being addressed in the biomedical space right now. I mean, we saw during the pandemic how difficult it was to continue clinical trials because just recruitment can be an issue. And I don't think that's something that really the industry had seen before. So we talked a fair amount, touched on scale up and manufacturability. Let's go into a bit more specific and talk about what are the common pitfalls that you see when it comes to scale up and manufacturability. When folks bring you an idea or an early process, what are the first things that need to be changed?
Where do you begin?
Do you want me to start? I think that this question can be answered on so many different facets. So there's certainly the technical pieces there that we would recommend changing. Again, reaching out and knowing where your expertise lies. From a process point of view, we can certainly figure those things out. Those are often the easiest things to fix when we're approached in that way. I think one of the biggest pitfalls is spending the time to educate our partners on what this process looks like, the time it takes, the resources it takes to not only develop a process, but to support it from a regulatory point of view, to support the studies, the handoffs, because we're, at my site here in Madison, we're one small part of the overall timeline. So I know Aaron and I were talking earlier about if my part takes longer, that only crunches the toxicology studies on the other end. And so knowing those handoffs, but also educating our partners on what that looks like, where they need to provide input, where we don't have expertise, they may have to go find another consultant, or we may need to collaborate with the folks that are next in line for the program.
Yeah, and adding to one thing that you said about the changes since COVID, one of the things that we have seen over the last few years is, the supply chain with getting test material to us. There's been delays because they can't get the things that they need to make their test material, and that goes back to, if that process is delayed, then it delays everything, all the early development studies that are done at LabCorp.
And I'll just add to that, I do think one thing that COVID has taught us is that companies can go very fast to bring a drug to the clinic. They can go extremely fast, and we've really pushed the boundaries of what's possible there, maybe to a fault a bit, because that's becoming the expectation now on pushing new therapies to the clinic. So we can't do everything at breakneck speed. as we did in the pandemic. But there are certain lessons we were able to learn, make really robust risk assessments to take that risk-based approach to clinical development.
The COVID-19 story, I think, we should all be really proud to be part of this ecosystem, right? I mean, the entire sector, from academic labs to hospitals to pharma companies to biotechs to manufacturers to suppliers, this group of organizations came to attack this problem unprecedented, right? I think we should all be proud of the way that the life science ecosystem industry has risen to the challenge. And of course, the situation we face now is, as Emily said, the expectation. Why can't you do that for everything else, right? I think where large organizations are particularly good at, having the operational capacity and the finances, clinical trialists and the commercial engine are really good at what they do here. I think the opportunity in the biotech ecosystem in the earlier phase, where a lot of the ideas actually bubble up, is the fact that there's a whole mechanism by which multiple ideas can be tested rapidly, quickly, because it's basically crowdsourcing what's best, right? To move that along. And so, but in that path, oftentimes the challenge becomes when a company gets large enough to be able to get late preclinical data, early clinical data, the transfer of knowledge, information, capabilities becomes a bit of a challenge. There's a bit of a growth spurt that's expected, but it's challenging to scale from a smaller organization to a large organization model. And so often companies go into public markets IPOing or get acquired, but all of these require an evolution of what a large-scale organization looks like in terms of organizational capability and prosecutorial capability, right? So how do you scale from something small to large enough quantities effectively, quickly, safely, to get to the next batch amount to be able to test it in the clinic? And then certainly a process that is mature enough that a large pharma looks at saying, okay, we can actually take this and stick it in our systems to be able to make it, versus spending the next 18 months changing the technical aspects and the processes to get the attributes that they need for a commercially successful product. So some of these lines of sight conversations with partners early on is really helpful, particularly as early as in the late preclinical stage, to just begin talking to understand what your end goal could look like and what's expected either from a big pharma partner or your investor community. So keeping that conversations alive so that you're actually meeting the goals of what would carry the company forward further.
And Abhi, what do you see with things that folks bring to Pfizer?
Yeah, so within Pfizer, our approach to gene therapy has really been, we've had a build, buy, and partner strategy. And the goal has always been to be the leader in gene therapy and the partner of choice. And what that really means is that if these capabilities don't exist, we will build them on our own. So for example, we've invested $800 million to build in-house gene therapy manufacturing in North Carolina. It's something that we're really proud of. And it supports our 3 late-stage phase 3 gene therapy programs in Heme, Heme B, and DMD. And behind that, we have a multitude of programs that we don't disclose, but that we're working on internally and that we're really excited about. I think one of the lessons that we've learned from decades of experience in vaccines has been it's really important to invest early in manufacturing and to own that, because there's a lot of opportunity to expedite the entire development time by having a lot of control on the manufacturing itself. And by the way, gene therapies are one of the most phenomenally complex medicines that have ever been built. So even much more so, we require the best, brains and scientists. One of the nuances that we've really touched upon has been the trade-off between optimization and speed. So for example, some of the partners or some of the folks that we talk to may have chosen a manufacturing approach that was right sized for them really early on. And while it makes sense to optimize it along the way, you may, really identify your dose really early on in your phase 1/2, where, you would actually lose time by optimizing. And therefore, you have to value these trade-offs and say, do you, use a process that you have in hand, or do you spend time to optimize? And I think that's been one of the really, really gems of learnings that we've had, that these are nuanced decisions, asset specific, based on the science as well as, the landscape of these therapies. So this is kind of how we've been thinking about it. But in a holistic sense, it really is dependent upon the science, because the vast majority of gene therapies are open label studies. That means you're really designing, phase 1/2 studies that have different cohorts where you're trying to identify a dose. And as soon as you do, you expand it, and that becomes your phase 3. And so sometimes you hit, you get really lucky on your first cohort, as has been done before in the industry. And sometimes you have to really wade through and find that dose. So all these things kind of come together and shape kind of the overall learnings. And then we try to feed it back. Now, the one lesson that we overall have is you have to think about manufacturing even before you're in the clinic. And that's just underscores the speed with which gene therapies are hitting the clinic, and the vast, importance that if you have phenomenal science and data, people really want you to expedite and develop these medicines for patients.
Absolutely. It's really, it warms my heart to think that we are at a point in the industry and in history where we can really start using the word cure. Genuinely. Thank you all for your input. I want to take a moment and sort of poll the audience and see if there are any questions that folks have out in the audience here. We've got microphones on either side. If there aren't any questions at this point, we'll continue the discussion, but really we'd like this to be an interactive session. So.
Hi, yes, I do have a very generalized question. So in big pharma and in companies that are supporting the development process, how much emphasis are you placing on the availability of drug as a continuum after a patient has entered clinical trials? Because this is a huge aspect in my decision-making about whether or not we adopt a clinical trial, because I don't want to put a patient on a drug and then take them off when they're a responder. Obviously there's immunogenicity concerns. We simply don't want to remove that therapeutic option for a patient. How much is this in the forefront of your thinking and planning as you're going through the development process? And I'm speaking in very generalized terms, not just gene therapy, not just biologics. Like globally, how much emphasis do you guys place on this aspect of the development process? Availability through the continuum. Once you place a patient on, will they have access to drugs forever until, it either doesn't work or it's marketed? Okay.
So maybe I'll start.
I'm not, that's not for me.
So generally speaking, I mean, it is paramount, right? Because, to the points that you outlined, that, why are we doing all this? It's really for the patient. And, we really consider the heroes as the patients that are in the trials. They're really paving the way for, the entire, population that's in that disease. So we take manufacturing and supply really seriously. And like you said, to not just supply the trial, but also, what comes afterwards. And so we tend to think about it holistically. And like you said, small molecules, biologics, gene therapies, we tend to have that mantra. I could tell you that this was an important consideration when we thought about our manufacturing strategy, at least for gene therapy, is that, we're building this capacity, but it's important to figure out how you right size it, because you're going to try to supply, an entire market. And what that really means is, for like a global organization like Pfizer, that it's really the globe. right? So it's not just one geography somewhere, but it's also the recognition that these therapies will go online at different times across the world. But at some point, you're going to have to reconcile, all that. So these are some of the things that, that we think about.
So just to share some past experiences, having been with, Pfizer, Allergan, AbbVie, is generally when you go into a development paradigm, no company expects to fail in those studies, right? That's not the expectation. And so what happens is when you have your phase 1 going, you still have internal activities, planning and thinking about your phase 2. As your phase 1 data rolls out, right, it'll inform your phase 2, but you're planning to succeed. So you have those things planned in terms of making sure drugs available for the trials. And the expectation, of course, is it'll continue. And typically what happens is when you get to about phase 3-ish, patient recruitment tends to be interesting in the context of who's available, how many trials are going for the same indication, the competition, et cetera. And so what happens is these are decisions that are typically crafted as part of the development team strategy on, do we keep patients on, those who participate, if it was working, do they go on? And then at the end of the study, those that were on placebo, could you convert them into the treatment group as part of the program itself? Those are discussions that actively happen as part of the development strategy. As I say that, it certainly is the expectation when the hypothesis is accepted in phase 3 that you do go into a commercial space, that all patients will have access to theoretically, will have access to drugs. And as Abhi pointed out, this will be rolled out in different countries based on their own internal regulators and the timeline. But generally speaking, as far as planning goes, it is with the expectations that we will be successful, and therefore we plan ahead in terms of making sure material is available for trials and beyond. But at some point, decisions will be made because the clinical data either speaks to efficacy or not, and that's a different conversation when you terminate a program. So.
And I would just add, strictly from a supply point of view, since we're a manufacturer, we're not the sponsor of the clinical trial, we do work with a number of our partners to ensure that scheduling is appropriate. So with the patients in mind, how many patients are we supporting here? Do we need to rearrange our schedule because we have time in another program to allocate that capacity there? So we will work with them, but I think from my perspective, we're a little more reactive to that and not involved in so much of the planning as the drug sponsors are.
Yes.
So I noted earlier that somebody said the aim is for Pharmacom to get product to patients in a standardized way. But we know patients respond very, very differently to a product, and some patients can take 3-4 times the dose that another patient can. And there's a lot of interest in personalized medicine. So how feasible do you really think it is that we could truly have really personalized therapies, personalized doses, personalized regimes for patients?
So I think it is feasible. We've done a few programs for personalized cancer vaccines out of Catalent. It is a timeline, again, similar to what we experienced in the pandemic, that's required to support the personalized cancer, because you are pulling information from the patient to then design your drug and deliver it back. And so the timelines that are necessary for that are quite accelerated to support those patients. So I do think it's possible, and I think facilities are available to support that, but it does take a large infrastructure to understand that drug design on a per patient basis.
Yeah, so the perspective I would add is I think you're seeing that today. When you think about, ex vivo versus in vivo gene therapy, you think about ex vivo as more of, where the patient is, you're developing a product for the patient. It's almost the highest form of personalized medicine. But even within in vivo, you're delivering vector genomes per kg, to patients depending on, that patient's makeup and weight. But at the same time, no two patients are different. And so there exists, tests, for example, looking at, a patient's neutralizing antibodies profile to see, is this gene therapy relevant for him or her? And I think that's really important to understand because, like you said, like the whole aspect of personalized medicine is to making sure that the right patient gets the right drug. And so I think today we have the tools to do that, and you're seeing some really clever folks trying to answer this question. And frankly, that's one of the things that really excites us when we talk to some of these, really clever and bright, biotech startups, because they have a really interesting approach in that they've really put a lot of thought into precision medicine.
To add on to that, if you put aside infectious diseases, right? So personalized medicine is sort of a host response model, yeah? And what used to be larger populations, we are on the journey in that direction where we've moved from large patient population, one drug sort of fits that model into more tailored, either because of tumor typing, then we segment that into a smaller bucket, and then we move that further along to autologous cell therapy, which is at the moment the more individualized approach. And then certainly with gene therapy for correction, which again is a bit more, it's not individualized necessarily, but again, a smaller patient population. As we get smaller in the patient population, there are several elements that need to get sorted out within the larger ecosystem, from the payers as well as the regulators and the manufacturers and the product development marketers, right, companies. Because the speed and the economics of that will be a question that we need to address collectively, right? So what is the cost of making that individual drug for the individual, and how will that be paid for over collectively in an environment where we share the cost of healthcare? So that's a public policy payer, a larger conversation for the entire ecosystem. But to Emily Zanabi's point is we have been on this journey from a large population to a smaller population, precision personalized medicine. We have been on that journey for a few decades now. Are we down to the individual? In isolated select cases, but.
Okay. My question is, are there any organizations that provide business cash value evaluations for early stage pharmaceutical companies to help founders and VCs find agreeable deal terms?
I think that's a question for you.
So there are consultants and third-party groups that are out there that could help you come to a sense of where the range of valuation would be. But general rules of thumb that individuals will apply would be, what is the last couple of deals, the last year, how many deals have been completed for a company of a similar type, and therefore, what can you expect as a valuation? But I will say that's changed dramatically over the last maybe 12 months, maybe 18 months, given the financial condition that the whole world is going through. But that is not to say that the expectation could be one, what someone's willing to pay, and value is another, yeah? That's, again, a negotiation. But general rule of thumb, you look at past history. And VCs will have an idea of what they're willing to pay, and they have their internal metrics, right, because they've done a few deals. But I think founding companies, founders should really get their own numbers and maybe hire a partner to help them value, and certainly their own legal team that's going to protect their interests as founders, because one of the challenges with investors is how much equity would you be surrendering in exchange for cash, and how much control will you still have? So those are conversations to have in terms of the founders, what your comfort zone is in this particular road. And there are options like TA today that talked about when you are profitable, there are different options depending on the stage of the company itself in terms of your evolution as well as your profitability.
So in Wisconsin, actually, and this is, I worked for a very small startup company in Madison. In Wisconsin, there are resources that match up particular, starting ventures, say biotech, with angel investors and with VCs. So that are just interested in investing in Wisconsin. I don't have the exact name right now, but I know that that is a resource in Wisconsin for Wisconsin companies.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we have one more question from the audience.
So to follow on with where that discussion wrapped up, it's fantastic to see New York and Boston and Wisconsin represented here. When we talk about the concept of the village, how do you build those relationships? We're all commercial entities. You're all commercial entities up on the stage. How much of this is a commercial engagement? How much of this is a community engagement? How do you build and leverage those networks to grow well and quickly?
So maybe I'll start. Phenomenal question, right? So it's it's not just, I will say, commercial, right? So you have to start. You think about it holistically in the sense that, at least our experience has been, there's a great voice that the patient communities have, and many times the smartest people in the room are the patients, because their life literally is at stake. So they know all the therapies that are in development. They know the pros and cons. And while we all experience, for example, COVID lockdowns, some of these patients and communities, just to be on a trial, have had to isolate themselves from a very, very, early on period. So I think in terms of the community, one, the patients have an incredible voice, and we've seen that again and again. Number two, I think the scientific community also has a big say, because there's a multitude of platforms out here, and each has their pros and cons. And how do you connect that into something you can actually develop into a drug? It's not like a singular person can answer that. So it certainly takes a village to understand what is the patient needing, and does the science really support it? And I think where companies like Pfizer come in is to say, look, we have a lot of rich experience, in different modalities in developing drugs, and there are certain practices that we know that need to, take place. So why don't we just work together, and see if there's some promise to, this new idea and new concept.
Yeah, I really think it's a mixture of both the commercial as well as the community. In the scientific community, we need to understand and appreciate what each of us bring to the table, so that we can leverage that and build off of it, to have the best offering and be able to push these therapies to the clinic and to the patients ultimately. So it's we're going to leverage each other from a commercial point of view, but also to Abhi's point is understanding what the patients need and meeting that.
I might add that it's not disconnected, community and commercial. And I don't have to tell you that warfarin came out of here. And so in terms of getting something out to be commercially successful, there is experience in Wisconsin. And I'll also add that what Dr. Cook mentioned earlier, the reason he stayed was because there were lots of bright people that he graduated that were his students. And so the question then is, how would an environment, a community begin harnessing that know-how to expand and build an economy that is based and built around life sciences, to compete with Boston, New York, right? And there are a couple of interesting things that have happened over the last couple of decades with pharma changing, but big pharma changing its business structures. There are lots of expertise that have been let out of these walls. So there are lots of people who are consultants, who have expertise in specific pockets of drug discovery development, of diagnostics discovery development, and you name it. So you can access information. But we're still social animals, which means we still want to interact and have sort of face-to-face conversations. And I think the ecosystem within Wisconsin has already demonstrated that it's doable here. And so the question becomes, how do you begin engineering the serendipity that you have? So how do you organize networking and forums that begin developing these pockets of sparks that could energize not just idea, but begin moving the idea from paper to product and commercialization? And it really helps that you have anchors of life sciences companies here. LabCorp, Catalent represented here, Aldevron we heard about. And so whether that was happenstance or by design, once there is a footprint of a scientific organization, a life sciences ecosystem, then the idea is how do you fuel that to keep expanding? And that's what Boston did and San Francisco did. I'm not sure it was by design or happenstance, I don't know. Tech companies did that, so Washington State became this tech company with Intel and Microsoft and Amazon because Microsoft started something. And so once there are a couple of bigger players, I think the question is, how do you begin expanding and fueling that growth with other ideas and entrepreneurs, innovation, funding, public policy that supports that in terms of education, recruitment, retention. So it's a public-private partnership, I think, that will keep Wisconsin growing in this direction because demonstrated success already.
And I don't think I could find a better way really to describe BioForward, right? That's the organization. So I think the sum total of the comments that we have here is engage in this community. And with that, I think we've come to essentially the end of our time. I'd like to thank you all again for your intention and your engagement today.